In America, the line between genius and madness has always been thin. But what if someone crossed it not by accident, but by design? This isn't a story about a monster in the dark. It's about a man who believed intellect could rewrite morality. A man who turned brilliance into a weapon sharper than any blade. His name was Elliot Vance. For nearly 2 decades, law enforcement didn't know his face, didn't know his voice, only his mind, mapped out through a series of riddles, codes, and impossible crimes that left the smartest people in the country chasing shadows. The agents had a nickname for him. They called him the Architect. Because every move, every clue, every life that intersected with his felt designed, as if the world itself was part of his blueprint. Elliot wasn't born into darkness. He was born into light, the kind that blinds. From the moment he could speak, he asked questions most adults couldn't answer. By 8, he was solving calculus problems for fun. By 15, he was already attending lectures at MIT, sitting silently in the front row while professors double-checked their own math before speaking. But what no one realized then was that Elliot didn't just want to understand how things worked. He wanted to understand why they broke. His journals from that time, later uncovered by investigators, were filled with strange sketches. Circuit boards shaped like human hearts, equations describing emotion as a variable. He wrote, "Every system has a weakness. Even people that line would come to define everything that followed." At MIT, Elliot lived like a ghost among prodigies. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't an outcast either. He simply existed, quiet, observant, meticulous. The kind of student who never missed an assignment but never shared his thoughts out loud. His roommate once said, "He didn't study like the rest of us." He'd stare at patterns on the wall for hours, like he was decoding something the rest of us couldn't see. By his 2nd year, Elliot had already built a prototype for what would later be recognized as an early form of machine learning, an algorithm capable of predicting decision-making behavior with eerie accuracy. This was the early 2000s, long before the term AI meant anything to the public. But to Elliot, it was never about innovation. It was about prediction, control. He saw human behavior as a system that could be manipulated, optimized, and ultimately rewritten. While most students chased internships and startup dreams, Elliot chased perfection. And for him, perfection wasn't in creating, it was in mastering. He began quietly hacking university systems, not for money or fame, but to observe. He'd break through cybersecurity layers, leave no trace, then restore them even stronger. A ghost cleaning up after himself. It wasn't long before the digital fingerprints of a genius began appearing in places they shouldn't have been. A local bank, a hospital network, even a defense contractor's server. No damage, no theft. Just data moved, reorganized, studied. Years later, the FBI would call this the pattern phase. The time before he turned from student to strategist. The moment before curiosity evolved into something else. In 2006, something changed, something snapped, or maybe something finally clicked. Boston police were called to a quiet apartment in Beacon Hill after a neighbor complained about a strange smell. Inside, they found a man, an investment banker, sitting upright in a chair, lifeless. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no fingerprints. On the wall behind him, projected in flickering binary code, were 2 words: checkmate. It took weeks for digital forensics to decode the binary string. When they did, they discovered it wasn't random, it was a message. Coordinates. Those coordinates led to a small park across town, where investigators found another clue. A USB drive embedded in the base of a chess statue. Inside the drive was an encryption key and another puzzle. The FBI was now officially involved. And for the first time, they realized this wasn't just a murder, alternative crime scene. It was an equation. Over the next few months, similar events unfolded in other cities, each one following the same eerie pattern, a high-profile individual found in a staged, almost ritualistic way, always accompanied by a binary riddle, a cipher, or a clue pointing to the next scene. He wasn't killing, targeting victims for revenge or thrill. He was orchestrating something, a grand design built on logic and precision. Federal analysts began calling him the architect, not as a nickname, but as a title, because this was not chaos. This was structure. By 2010, the FBI formed Project Null, a task force dedicated entirely to one goal, finding the architect. But every time they got close, their leads evaporated. Digital traces vanished. Wiretaps picked up false information, planted by Elliot himself. He anticipated every move before they made it. An agent later said, "It was like he was in the room with us. Every single time." And in a way, he was. Through data, he'd already modeled their behavior, their patterns, their thought processes, even their emotional reactions. They were variables in his equation: predictable, programmable, beatable. Elliot's terror wasn't loud. It wasn't blood or chaos. It was quiet, calculated dominance. He erased boundaries between digital and human. Forensic psychologists studying his work later said his goal wasn't to destroy systems. It was to perfect them, to prove that he, and he alone, understood how they truly worked. Then, in 2013, a spark of luck, or fate, cracked the silence. A young cryptographer named Lena Morales found something strange buried deep within a dark web encryption archive. A series of corrupted data packets that shouldn't have existed. When she decrypted them, she found GPS coordinates. They led to a storage facility outside Reno, Nevada. Inside one of the units, investigators found hundreds of notebooks, each filled with Elliot's precise handwriting, equations, human behavior models, system maps, and then, something chilling, detailed psychological profiles of every agent assigned to his case, their habits, their fears, their relationships. He had predicted their moves, years before they made them, but Elliot himself was nowhere. The notebooks gave the task force what they'd never had before: insight, not into what he'd done, but into why. One line written in the center of a page stood out: "A perfect design ends with symmetry. When they think they've caught me, that's when the game begins." Weeks later, the FBI received a video. It was short, simple. A man, face half lit, sitting in front of a black screen. It was Elliot. "Greater than every empire collapses from within," he said calmly. "Mine will too. But not before you realize you've been living in it." Then the video glitched, and the file deleted itself from every connected drive. Moments later, chaos. The FBI's cyber lab went dark. Every system crashed simultaneously. Security footage vanished, and by the time they rebooted, the entire case archive, thousands of gigabytes, was gone. Some said he destroyed it to erase himself. Others believed it was his final test, that somewhere inside that digital collapse, he'd planted a new beginning. Because almost immediately afterward, new patterns began appearing online. Encrypted messages, unknown algorithms, digital fingerprints identical to his early code. But in places no one expected. Corporate servers, social networks, government systems. The architect was gone, but his design wasn't. For months after the FBI's systems went dark, strange digital echoes began to surface. A string of anomalies that didn't make sense, yet felt unmistakably deliberate. The government email network locked itself in a recursive loop, each password resetting itself every 11 minutes. A defense satellite drifted 3 degrees off course, then corrected automatically, like someone was testing control. And buried inside the code of a small cybersecurity startup, an encryption signature, the same one Elliot had used a decade earlier. The message was clear. He was still out there. Not as a man, as a pattern. Publicly, the Bureau declared the case closed. Privately, Project Null continued. Smaller, quieter, almost obsessive. They built algorithms to hunt for anomalies. They combed through data leaks, looking for the fingerprints of a ghost. But every trail ended the same way. in noise, chaos, and dead servers. The agents who'd chased him the longest started to break down. Careers collapsed, marriages ended. A few even quit entirely, convinced they were being watched, manipulated, rewritten. One of them, Agent Calloway, later told a journalist off record, "It wasn't just that he outsmarted us, it's that he rewired the way we thought about trust itself." Meanwhile, whispers began circulating online. Anonymous posts on encrypted forums claimed to have seen Elliot, a hooded figure in a Nevada diner, a man with mirrored glasses at a tech conference in Berlin, a voice on an underground podcast, quoting his journal lines word for word. But none of the claims could be verified. The architect was no longer a person. He was a myth that adapted to belief. Every unexplained hack, every algorithm glitch, every mysterious system failure, someone somewhere whispered his name. And over time, the story of Elliot Vance began to evolve into something larger. A modern parable about the cost of intelligence and the seduction of control. To understand Elliot, you have to understand what he valued most: symmetry. In his notebooks, every concept, mathematical or moral, circled back to balance. It was as if the architect had never left.